I recognize a few of you, so unfortunately some of what you're going to hear this morning is going to be pretty much the same thing you heard last time you saw me. But maybe I'll try to put a little spin on it, and I never have the exact same thing to say twice, so maybe you will learn a little bit of something this morning on my presentation. Some of my colleagues that are here to follow, they'll be here soon, Amy Fox and Kelly, and there'll be some more information down the road from those folks that you haven't heard from at all. And when we get to the Delphi technique, we're going to try to give you some pointers that you can use to defeat some of these things that are going on. So I put this up on the screen because at first, when I first started this thing, I think I'm pretty comfortable in this room talking about Agenda 21 and I don't have to slowly work my way into it. But I put this up because right now, this is very, very, it is very today, especially if you tell someone that global warming doesn't exist, or at least that man-made global warming doesn't exist. I assure you, if you haven't seen it already, you are a pariah as soon as you say that. So I like to start these things out. Do you ever wonder where sustainable development comes from, if you've heard that term at all? All this going green, the solar power, the wind power, all these different, did it just kind of happen on its own one day? Somebody said, you know, we're running out of electricity, we need to do something else. No, not really. As a matter of fact, it is an agenda and it's been going on for quite some time. Before you wrap your head around a lot of this, the first thing I think you kind of have to do is you have to understand that there are people in this world that do not necessarily have the individual's best interest in mind. What they really have in mind is control of the individuals and all of the resources and everything that's going on. And this isn't anything new in history. If you've listened to Bill Federer at all, he'll show you how power continually tries to concentrate itself back into one individual if it possibly can. It seems that evil just kind of keeps working its way that way. And as I've said an awful lot of times in these presentations, until Christ returns, evil will not quit. So we're going to have to stay very, very vigilant and work very hard against some of these forces that exist. So where all this came from is there is a movement out there of individuals that would truly like to have the world in one world type of governance or government. I want to say one world rule or whatever. It's not quite as horrible as that sounds, but it's just about as bad. So how are they going to go about this? What are they going to do to get there? They realized this quite some time ago that the United Nations was not going to be the vehicle that they thought it was going to wind up being. They wanted the United Nations, what the initial plan of the United Nations was to take all the weaponry in the world, all the tanks, nobody would have armies anymore, all the weapons would wind up being in the in the United Nations, and there would effectively be no wars anymore. The United Nations would take care of all of that. That is my understanding of what the United Nations was supposed to be when it kind of got created. Anybody have any kind of a different thought about that? Well, they found out real quick during the Cold War that that wasn't going to happen. Nations were not going to give up their weaponry. There were going to be superpowers. There was an arms race already on right after during World War II. And so that wasn't going to happen. So these folks that wanted to do these sorts of things had to figure out some other vehicle that they could use. And that vehicle is the environmental movement. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we get into things. But I believe we have to start at the very base, and that's why I talk about the history of Agenda 21 and lead you to where we are today. And then Amy Fox and Kelly and some others will come in and talk to you and show you how these things are being implemented in our communities every single day. So with that having been said, we'll go ahead and start here. Whoops, wrong way. So United Nations Agenda 21, we talked about where it kind of came from. Well, in their preamble, it says there is to employ international machinery for the promotion of economic and social advancement of all peoples. Now, first of all, I didn't know that's what the United Nations really came. When I started doing this research, again, like I said, from my understanding, it was to prevent wars, right? Well, then they come up with this. Now, I have to wonder, what type of international machinery are they talking about? And I will tell you this also, if you want to find out any of these things or you wonder where it came from, almost all of the information that you'll see on these slides comes directly from the United Nations documents or some other form of government documentation. I haven't made up a single thing that's on this slide. Some of it I may have put in my own words. If I have, I'll show you. But most of everything that is on this presentation comes directly from documents related to the United Nations, the EPA, Department of Transportation, something of that nature, okay? I used to drag it all around with me. I have a great big satchel, and it has each document that I pulled it from. Because I always wonder if there happens to be someone in one of these groups that maybe doesn't would like to challenge the information or what have you. So I normally have it on hand. I don't, unfortunately, have it on hand today. I just kind of stopped carrying that stuff around. But it does exist, and I can get it to you anytime you want to look at it. So this is where the United Nations system comes in, and I've got till 10:15. Isn't that right, Judy? Okay, so all of these things happen in layers. The United Nations and most government agencies don't just take the first step and say, well, let's start implementing solar energy. They don't do that. They study and they look and they study and they look. And if they did do it in a reasonable manner that a business does, or how you run your home, then they would save a whole bunch of money. So to do it the way they have to do it, they continue to spend money and can, in my opinion, create their own existence, quite honestly. If bureaucracies didn't continue to continuously spend and study and find out, then they wouldn't really need to exist that much. So one of the first things we have to look at in this layer, in these layers, is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Founded in 1948, they're the first global environmental organization. They are the leading authority on environmental and sustainable development issues in the world today, and they have official observer status at the United Nations General Assembly. Now what that generally means is that they can sit in on every meeting that the United Nations, I'm trying to stand somewhere where I can see the most faces. There's holes here, they're a little interesting. So with that having been said, what they do is they can sit in on any meeting that the United Nations has, and they obviously don't have a vote, but they certainly are the policy driver at the United Nations for everything that happens when it comes to environmental issues, sustainable development, or what have you. So these are the guys that are the leaders. Not only this, but they also, and we'll talk about this a little later when we get into non-government organizations, they are the guys that determine whether your organization is worthy to be designated an environmental or a non-government official organization through the United Nations. You'll find out why that's a little bit important later. We'll talk about it too. So in America, there are 59 national non-government organizations such as the LA Zoo, the Smithsonian Institute, and the Pew Charitable Trust. All these groups are part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. There are 28 international non-government organizations. One of them is the National Geographic Society. I was a little bit upset when I found that because I kind of like to watch National Geographic, and they got some interesting stuff on there. But understand that whether they happen to actually be a part of the agenda or not, they are because they've signed up. And I think a lot of these things these days, a lot of companies are going green and all these other things. Because if they don't, what did we do the very, very first slide here? Oh, you're not a believer. You don't think it's going to happen. You're doing wrong. You need to get with the program. So that's kind of why I think some of these organizations in here. If you're a farmer, eco-agricultural partners, I would be very concerned about them, and I would learn everything I could about them. And then, of course, we have the infamous Sierra Club. There are state levels in the IUCN with the Department of State, the Department of Commerce, Agriculture, Interior, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Did you know we had a U.S. Agency for International Development? How about it, these, when you, natural disasters we might have overseas in one nature, or hurricanes or tsunamis, what have you, you'll see these bags of what I presume is rice or some of the grains, and it'll say USAID on it, and they're passing it from boats, and that's the U.S. Agency for International Development. That's where all of that food comes from, is from the United States. We are still evil around the world, right? So we have the Ramsar Treaty as one of the next things. I think this is probably the best side to stand on because I can see the most people. The Ramsar Treaty then comes along in 1971 with the idea for the global preservation of wetlands. They work very closely with the IUCN, and the United States signed on in April of '87. Who was in office in April of '87? Reagan. I brought that up because you're going to find out as we continue to go along that this has very little or nothing to do with party affiliation. Now I will tell you that Democrats and the left wing of the Democrat Party are the drivers. They're the guys that are doing the propaganda. They're making this happen. But unfortunately, our elected Republican leaders are falling right in play. Almost all of them to a T, especially at the national level. Now you get down here to the local level, a lot of our state representatives and state senators, we've worked with them very, very hard. They understand Agenda 21, and a lot of them have tried to do something about it. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. If you have a question as we go along here, and it's just a brief question, I'll handle it maybe, but this does take just about 45 minutes or so to get through. So if it's a quick one, pop it up. If it's not, write it down, and we'll try to answer it at the end of the day. So in American today, wetlands, there's 34 locations with some 4 million acres. Known as wetlands of international importance. Now, why is that a big? First of all, why would we be concerned that the international community cares anything about our wetlands? I don't necessarily care that they understand anything about our wetlands, all right? But for whatever reason, that's what all of this is about. Now, a lot of people will tell you, well, you know, the rest of the world isn't involved in what we've got going on. Who's heard of the White River Watershed National Blueway? If you heard about that, great people in here. This is why it's important. Blueway, Section 5 in the nomination document states they're globally important wetlands. Right here in Missouri, right here in Missouri and in Arkansas are globally important wetlands. So I had a bit of a problem with that in the Blueway designation, and that's one of the reasons why we helped stop it. The next layer in this cake is the CITES Treaty, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Here's another thing. As you start learning about Agenda 21 and this environmentalist movement, there's two things you need to have. You probably need to have Wikipedia next to you, because most of the words you're going to want to look up are not in your standard English dictionary. It is a bunch of gobbledygook that your average individual will not understand, and after you've read about 2 or 3 pages of it, you'll be so tired and bored of it, you'll throw it away and you'll want to forget it. And you won't want to know anything about it. So I guess maybe that's why I do some of it, so that you guys don't have to. So it was adopted in 1963 by the International Union on Conservation of Nature, also known as the Washington Conference, and it's known as that because really this was not going anywhere in the world until what? It got to America, and that's why it's also known as the Washington Conference. And it was signed on in 74, effective in 75, and the United States was the very first signatory. But it didn't have any teeth to it. The treaty had no teeth by itself. Each country had to come up with their own laws. So in America, we come up with the Endangered Species Act. Executive Order 11911, signed in 76. Nixon signed the treaty, and he also signed the Endangered Species Act. Now, you could maybe argue that saving the bald eagle was a good thing. You could maybe argue that it wouldn't be a good thing. But how about the smeltfish in California that cut off water to probably one of the greatest growing regions in the entire world? This, folks, is where we used to get most of our winter vegetables. You remember 10 years ago when you went to the grocery store, you got product of California, produce of California, right? Almost that lettuce, almost all of it in the wintertime came from California. What do you see now? Chile, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, places like that, okay? So it's not happening here in America. We'll get to why that's important a little bit later on. All right, so also in 72 we had the Environmental Protection Treaty between the United States and Russia. Russia disbanded, of course, so the USSR disbanded, so it had to be renegotiated in 1994. Which one of our buddies was in office in 94?
Clinton.
Bill Clinton, So this is where they come up with the World Heritage Treaty. In America, since 72, 68% of all U.S. parks, monuments, and reserves have been designated heritage areas. In 1995, you ask, why is that a big deal? What's wrong with having some heritage areas that we want to save and preserve for everybody and for some futures, for generations to come? Maybe there isn't a problem with that, and if our country wants to do that, that might be fine. My question is, what does the world have anything to do with it? Yeah. Okay, so this is why it's a problem. In 1995, the Crown Butte Mines wanted to do some mining 3 miles from Yosemite National Park. Now, you may have heard, some people will tell you that the United Nations owns our parks or owns parts of them. I don't believe that they own any of our parks or even any parts of it or our monuments. I can't find any information on that. If you find that they actually physically own it, please let me know. I'll use that in the future. But one probably worse thing they can do is control some of it. And this is how they control it. With 1995, Crown Butte Mines trying to do that. The environmentalist movement here in America tried to get that stopped. They went to Congress and every person to court and everybody they possibly could get to. The court said no, Congress said no, Crown Butte Mines is doing exactly what they can do. They own the land, they have the right to do this sort of stuff. The environmentalist movement then went to the United Nations. When the United Nations found out what was going on, they came along and they said, we are declaring Yosemite National Park a World Heritage Site in danger because of 3 miles away, Crown Butte Mines wanting to do some mining. What happened at that point? Because of the treaty that we signed, Crown Butte Mines had to pull out. They were not allowed to do any mining in that area, and they were done. So this is how they control things and stop a lot of different things, development that we could do. So, then we come along to the Stockholm Conference in '72, known as the United Nations Earth Summit #1. It's also known as the Conference on Human Environment, led by Maurice Strong. He was the Secretary General. You're going to see Maurice Strong's name an awful lot as we go through here. I recommend you do a little more research on him. It's my understanding right now he's in exile in China. He was a Canadian oil magnate for a long time. He has been the mover and shaker in the environmentalist movement through the United Nations since its conception. As a matter of fact, he was the leader of an awful lot of the different conferences and things that went along to create the United Nations Environment Program. This is where we get right here, you get UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. So this is where non-government organizations really start to come into play. A non-government organization such as the Sierra Club, Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, or what have you, in an awful lot of respects will work with government agencies to impose various different regulations in a myriad of things, not just the environment. But what they'll do is they'll come along and they say, well, you know what, we represent the people. The Sierra Club represents the people, and the people are saying, we would like you, Mr. Government, to do X, Y, or Z. Well, of course, in reality, who in here is a member of the Sierra Club? Yeah, so they don't necessarily represent the people, do they? But government is starting to get this idea, and they also call them stakeholders. You will see the term stakeholder time after time after time. I have, however, not found in any of the documents that I've worked with so far that a private property owner is a stakeholder. Haven't seen that yet. Still looking for it. So this is where the environmental issues start hitting the mainstream in the world and America. This is where they created UNEP, and they came up with 26 principles and 109 recommendations. Now, we have to realize that in America, we have had some problems with environmental issues, haven't we? And we still have some problems today. Who lives around Bridgeton? Yeah, problem right there, isn't there? Okay, so that is going to have to be dealt with. It's my understanding the EPA would like to dig it all up, transport it to somewhere else, and rebury it. And Missouri, and this is something, folks, I don't know if you're that familiar with it, but it's my understanding that this is some of the most very toxic stuff that can be toxic. I mean, on the chart of 1 to 100 in toxicity, it's 100.1. Okay, so as a matter of fact, there wasn't a little underground fire they were worried about at some time up there, I think. Still worried about that. So it's a serious problem. It's moving. Wow. So the other plan is to entomb it right where it is. Yeah.
Can you digress on that a little bit?
It's all right. Mallinckrodt and a couple of other agencies in St. Louis or companies helped create nuclear parts for the Nuclear Manhattan Project during World War II and beyond. And an awful lot of that waste, that nuclear waste, they didn't know what really nuclear waste was all about. They put it in 55-gallon drums and they buried it in the ground. The Mallinckrodt site out farther east in, what county is that? Helping? Warren County, maybe?
Weldon Springs.
Okay, Weldon Springs, okay. That was a very serious hot spot for a long time. I was an operating engineer for some time here in the St. Louis area, Local 513, and they would tell this story about going out there all the time. Guys would have to wear respirators with oxygen tanks on their equipment. They would get in there in that equipment, they would work about 10 minutes, and they would have to get off of that equipment and leave, get decontaminated, and then the next guy comes in and works his 10 or 15 minutes. That's how hot this environment was. It was horrible. But they got the Mallinckrodt, that was part of the Superfund cleanup. If anybody's heard of the Superfund cleanup. So they got that cleaned up and it's in pretty good shape now. But this place in Bridgeton, what I understand, and I don't know a lot about it, is supposed to be multiple times worse than what Weldon Spring ever was. So what they're, yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Normally when you bury nuclear waste, you should have it encased in concrete.
Concrete.
They put the barrels, barrels with the waste in them, just ordinary
Right on dirt.
steel barrels.
Yeah.
They put it into trucks, backed the trucks down in there, left the trailer, and buried the trailer. That's all. So that'll rust, that'll all corrode. It's in a floodplain. There's the fault. Could be an earthquake thing. You know, all this kind of thing is.
It is a very serious, it's a very, very serious problem, and so we have to recognize those things. As conservatives even, we have to recognize that those sorts of things exist, and they're going to take a lot of money and time to fix, but there's good ways to do it, there's smart ways to do it, and there's really dumb ways to do it. Digging it all up and move it, in my opinion, is a dumb way. The other way they're talking about is trying to encase it in concrete right where it's at. I don't even know how you would begin to do that, but that's beyond me, I'm not an engineer. So there are some real problems in America, have been and still are, that need to be cleaned up. So we cannot dismiss the environmental movement completely, but we can dismiss what their actual agenda is. And we're going to get into that as we continue to move along. So this is what Maurice Strong thinks. It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class. Now, before I get into this too much, I told you that Maurice Strong was the Secretary General of this particular conference. You'll find him at the next one, and again, I told you that he has been a part of the movement from its conception, right? This, I bring in a few people in this because you must understand how the individuals that are putting all of this together think. If you can look at their words, you can understand how they think. This is how Maurice Strong thinks. It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. A shift is necessary toward lifestyles less geared to environmentally damaging consumption patterns. Now let me ask you just a little bit. This guy is a Canadian. He's talking in Stockholm, Sweden, in front of individuals, representatives from virtually every country in the world. When you read this, first of all, when he says affluent middle class, what country has an I'll give you a try. How many countries have an affluent middle class?
One.
A few.
Huh? Maybe a few,
Western
but
Europe.
primarily the United States. How about involving high meat intake? Probably the United States. How about consumption? This is a 1992. Consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods. How about the United States? Yeah. Okay, so then how about the use of fossil fuels? Yeah, that's us too. How about appliance? Well, a lot of places have appliances. But how about home and workplace air conditioning? How many places in Europe have air conditioning?
Not a lot.
Exactly. So who's he talking about?
Us.
He's talking about the United States, period, right here. You might want to say the Western way of life a little bit, but he's primarily talking about the United States, period. All right? So that's who he's talking about, and that's the way he thinks. Everything that we do in America is overboard. We have too much, and it's going to have to stop. There's too much consuming going on out there. So then we come into Habitat 1, Conference on Human Settlements, held in Vancouver, Canada in 1976. 64 recommendations for national action, also known as the Vancouver Action Plan. Now here's one thing I found interesting in research. If you go back and look at these old ones from 72, 92, this one right here in 76, right? You will find that they spoke very, very openly about what they wanted to do. If you look at the Agenda 21 document itself, it's a lot more vague. Because this is what they've done. They've taken all the parts from all of these different conferences and boiled it all together into their finalized project, which was Agenda 21. So as we're leading up to these things, they leave a glimpse of what they're thinking and what they have in mind. Let's take a look at what they have in mind in 1976 while they were in Vancouver. The only part I'm going to worry about is land. Land, because of its unique nature and the crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals, and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership was also a principal instrument of principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. Social justice, urban renewal and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. What does that tell you right there?
You left your property.
Bob,
That's socialism.
that is definitely socialism. You have no reason to own your own private land because private land is just an accumulation of wealth, and by the way, you don't deserve it all, and by the way, the only way that we can make it good is if we have it there for the use of the collective. That's the only word they didn't use in there is collective. They could have, I guarantee you they were thinking it, it tells you right here, of society as a whole. So again, this is the way and how they think. And all these folks that put this stuff together, and I'm going to say all, they think this way. Until recently, and that's only on climate change stuff, you haven't been seeing anybody coming away from the ranks, okay, from this environmental movement. We're getting a few people now coming out of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that are realizing that this is a hoax, or they're going too far with it. But from this movement, people aren't coming out of it. Yes?
I have a question. Do any of these people own land?
I'm sure they do. Oh, absolutely.
And they're of the upper class?
Oh yeah, look at Al Gore.
And they all use air conditioning.
Al Gore's got a 21,000 acre, or 21,000 square foot home from what I understand, but as long as it's green, we can use up anything he wants to. Yeah.
And the distinction, these guys writing this are not this middle class they're talking about, in the way I would suppose.
So actually a lot of them are, and or they're a little bit higher than that. Some of them reach your average every individual. Yep, that's true too.
But I mean, who builds the skyscrapers in the big cities? Is that the middle class?
No.
I don't, you know.
Well, they
my
do the work, of
suspicion-
course, but yeah, the developers, the planners, and developers, yeah. Okay, so then we move on to the next one is the Brundtland Commission. Known as the World Commission on Environment and Development, it was convened in 1983. This is where the term sustainable development comes from. It was first introduced during the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future. Now, it was known as the World Commission on Environment and Development, but it's called the Brundtland Commission because of who chaired it. Gru Harlem Brundtland. Again, we're going to have to talk about some of these people, and Gru is one of my new friends. Gru is, I still believe, the chairman of the World Health Organization. If she isn't, she's been involved in it very, very greatly. Again, this is one of those folks that you have to understand who they are. If you know who they are, you'll have a better understanding of how they think and what their intentions are. Gru is the former Prime Minister of Norway. She was a Norwegian Labour Party member. When you hear Labour Party, especially in Europe, what are you talking about? Communist, socialist, absolutely, Marxist. She was also a member of the Norwegian Humanist Association and still is. Those of you who are in this room that call yourselves by his name should understand that if you are a part of the Humanist Association, you have no idea who God is. You don't want to know who God is. You don't believe that God is who He is. You believe that humans are the highest authority, we're in control of our destiny, and we're the only ones that can change anything. That's who these folks believe. That's what these folks believe. And she was also, if that wasn't enough, she was the first vice president of Socialist International. We then move on to Earth Summit 2, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. 1992 was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, also known as the Rio Conference. Once again, Maurice Strong is the conference secretary general, and this is where he said that bit that I showed you earlier. This is where he said these things. And over 178 nations attended this, and the globalist George H.W. Bush showed up there, and he actually signed to the treaty, or excuse me, signed Agenda 21. And Al Gore was there leading the American delegation. Now out of this we have the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, because I truly believe that although Agenda 21 is the method to inventory, monitor, and control all of us and everything that we do, I believe that climate change is the driver. I don't think that they could convince enough people quickly enough of all the gobbledygook. By the way, this is United Nations Agenda 21. It is a real document. Somebody tells you it doesn't exist. They don't know what they're talking about. It actually does exist. This is is a single page, so it's a little thicker than it needs to be, but it's kind of nice for a nice prop there. Amy's probably got a good copy, or an actual copy of it. So anyhow, I believe that the climate change is the driver. That is the blueprint of how they're going to do things. So this is what came out of this conference, Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. Biodiversity Treaty, quite honestly, I think the Biodiversity Treaty is probably worse than Agenda 21, but it's when you get into it all, it's a lot thicker and a bigger problem. Then we have the forest annex, and we have the commission, and this is where the Commission on Sustainable Development came from. They're kind of your sustainable development cops, if you were, for lack of a better term. Forests, I put this on here, we're not going to talk about it a lot, but again, the mentality of these kind of folks, they believe that they should be able to control trees from the time that they're planted, whether it be by man or by nature, to the time that as they're growing, as they mature, as they're harvested, as they're then processed after the harvest, as they are then put into production into some form of product, then after that product is done with and to be disposed, they actually have rules on how all of that should happen. And they believe that they should control trees through that entire process. And if you look at it, they probably do. If you look at the way things really are, they probably do. So, this is the preamble of Agenda 21's conference plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which human impacts on the environment. Can you tell me in something that you do on a daily or an average day basis that does not impact on the environment? Yeah, me neither. Even breathing. So they want to control, or at least put some form of plan of action on every single thing that you do. In this, they also talk about, and if you can see that, the reaffirming the Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, that Stockholm meeting, and seeking to build upon it. So this is why I tell you that things are like a layer cake. They believe that too. So they're recognizing all of the work that's been done prior to this conference in Rio de Janeiro, and they're just adding it all together, and that's how you get Agenda 21. With the goal of establishing a new and equitable global partnership. So this is their goal right here. I talked a little bit earlier about the smelt fish, right? So let's say that somebody has an idea that they want to save the smelt fish, all right? Whatever, all right, let's say that's their only goal is to save the smelt fish. Well, maybe somebody else who believes in this equitable global partnership will come along and say, you know what? Save that little fish. You're just right. That's exactly what you should do. And oh, by the way, when we shut off the water to California, we can then go to some other parts of the globe and start a partnership with them and make sure that they get a little bit of our money because we have too much wealth here in America, right? So by shutting off the water because of the smelt fish to California, we have to go to Peru, Argentina, Mexico, all of those other places that we talked about a little earlier to get our raw vegetables now, right? So now we have some of the money in America being flooded out in some of these other countries in another way. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but NAFTA, GATT, the current, what is the new one, Trans-Pacific Partnership, evil, double evil, and worse evil. You
Must be pretty bad then.
Yeah, we have got to somehow get out of these trade agreements that we have with these other countries. It is destroying America for the sake of an equitable global partnership. I assure you, whether it's a part of Agenda 21 or not, this goal right here is a part of the entire leftist and Marxist movement, period. It's an equitable global partnership. America is evil because we have exploited the rest of the world by sucking all of its resources out of the ground, using it here in our greedy little country. We don't ever do anything else for the rest of the world, right? We just take it all for ourselves, therefore we must give something up. All right, so in that Agenda 21, there are 27 principles and 40 chapters and 351 pages. Now, when I came across equitable, I thought, all right, equity, and piece of property that I have. I was a little naive, but I looked at a nice big dictionary. Possessing or exhibiting equity, equal in regard to the rights of persons, giving each his due, just, fair, and partial, pertaining to a court of equity, the giving or disposition to give each man his due. Nothing says anything about earning or that you work for it or anything. It should just simply be given to you because you exist. How are they going to do this? They're going to use 3 prongs here: the environment, the economy, and social aspects to implement Agenda 21. Their goals are to reduce consumption, control factors of production, promote social equity, and they also require the preservation and restoration of biodiversity. I don't want to get into that too much again because we could be here in another hour just on that part. But just understand that biodiversity is a great big thing. And the more and more you start to read some of the documents that they use, you'll find out that habitat and habitat restoration is huge. It's absolutely huge, especially out in the outlying areas. Some of this does not apply so much to the cities. When Amy and Kelly start talking about some of the things, you'll find out how this really starts falling into what city development happens. But it's all still one big part of the package. How are they going to do it? They're going to do it through land use regulations, building codes, wetlands declaration. Who's heard of this? There's a family out west somewhere. I think it was in Utah. I could be wrong about the state. But they were building a home and had a neat thing, bought some property, building this nice big, really fancy, expensive home. Government comes along and says, guess what, guys? You're sitting on a wetland. They didn't know that. It looked pretty dry. But it was evidently an old wetland. I don't know all the ins and outs. Boil it down, they're taking their property away from those folks. They're declaring it a wetland right here, wetlands declaration, and they're not going to be able to live there. It's gone through court. They've lost, I think, spent all kinds of money, and they're just out. And this is a real horrible problem down in Florida. Florida is just, they're crazy with wetlands, and they're having some very serious problems and have had with the government for some time. So they also do these things through planning and zoning and through master plans. They also do it through global education. All media outlets are going green. How about the Ad Council? By the way, does everybody now, if you listen to the radio, does everybody know where the doggone forest is? I mean, come on. Do you really have to tell me to go out to the forest and explore the forest? I can see the woods, even for the trees. I know where they're at. I can get there if I want to. I'm thinking that even your most urban dweller downtown St. Louis can find their way to the doggone woods without an ad. But it's your dollars, do the Ad Council, and that's how they're putting this stuff out there and promoting it. You see it on TV all the time. So I think at schools, Common Core is flooded with it, and it was flooded. The schools were flooded with this stuff before Common Core ever came along. Although Common Core is a part of Agenda 21, the environment has been flooded into our schools for years and years and years. Our colleges are completely, utterly, and thoroughly indoctrinated. There isn't any other view. This is the view, sustainable development, period. Okay, so population control, and this is some of the methods to implement Agenda 21 and get their agenda across. Population control and reduction. I suggest you look at this. It happened down in Cuba, the United Nations International Conference on Population and Development. And again, folks, this is almost all of this came right off the UN website. Just go in and start searching the UN website. First of all, your head's going to explode. It's good information. It comes right out of their mouths. They're not. This isn't a conspiracy. A conspiracy is something that happens in the dark between a few people and that you're not supposed to know about until it comes to fruition and it happens. This is happening. I don't talk about population control too much because, again, that's another problem area, and it's just a serious problem. If you look at that yourselves, and you'll find out how disgusting it is. All right, so then we come along now. They'll tell you, everybody tells you, the United Nations Agenda 21 is not in America. And it's not in America primarily as Agenda 21. That is because in America, anytime before a treaty, any of these treaties can be ratified, they have to go through Senate, right? And get a 2/3 vote through the Senate. Well, they tried to get the Biodiversity Treaty and Agenda 21 through the Senate back in the early 90s after it was signed by George H.W. Bush. And we had some good people go up to Senate, one of them being I'm going to lose his name here,
Michael Kaufman.
Yeah, Michael Kaufman, thank you, Amy. Michael Kaufman went up to the Senate and said, you know what, guys, you don't want anything to do with this. If some of you have this packet, you'll see a map of the United States with a bunch of different colors. Dr. Michael Kaufman came up with that map and presented it to members of Congress and showed them why this was the end game. of what these folks wanted to do. So this never made it through the Senate. It didn't even get a vote through the Senate. It didn't even get there at all. So what does every good president do that doesn't get through the Congress whatever their agenda is? Executive order. Executive Order 12852 created the President's Council on Sustainable Development. During Bill Clinton's time from 1993 to 1996, there were 25 members appointed by the President, one of them being J. Gary Lawrence. Again, there's another name here, guys, so we're going to have to find out what he's all about. And their product at the end was called Toward a Sustainable America. This is it right here. This is a single page also. Very good information in here. You can download this from the internet. You can find that. I recommend you take a look at it. We're going to go over some of it, but that will give you a better idea of the way these folks think and what it is they're trying to accomplish. 25 members appointed. A lot of them were members of government agencies, EPA, Park Service, and these sorts of folks, but were also members of different corporations. The head of various corporations or their representatives were there. So J. Gary Lawrence being an advisor to all of this sort of stuff, like I told you, you're not going to hear the term Agenda 21 in America by anybody that's in the government. They don't even really use the term sustainable development that much. They use sustainable a lot. They don't necessarily use the term sustainable development as much. And this is why. J. Gary Lawrence goes over to England, and he's talking to some folks over in England. And by the way, in England, they're fully onto this stuff. They're fine with all of this. And I'll tell you why. You know, America is absolutely unique in its private property ownership. Although there are private property owners in Europe, they're very few and far between. Your average individual will not go to a European country and buy a couple of acres of land. You just won't. It's not available for purchase unless you've got a lot of cash, a whole bunch of cash. Then you might be able to get some. So America is unique in private property ownership. It was part of our founding. That's why we came into existence partially, was for private property ownership, right? So when you look at things in England, Europe in general, they don't think quite the same way we do when it comes to property. So they're, for the most part, okay with an awful lot of this stuff. So J. Gary Lawrence goes to England and he's talking to these city council people or whatever their terms are. And he says, in the case of the United States, our local authorities are engaged in planning processes consistent with Local Agenda 21, but there is little interest in using the Local Agenda 21 brand. Participating in a United Nations advocated process would very likely bring out many of the conspiracy fixated groups and individuals in our society, such as the NRA, citizen militias, and some members of Congress. This segment of our society, who fear one world government and a UN invasion of the United States through which our individual freedom would be stripped away, would actively work to defeat any elected official who joined the conspiracy by undertaking Local Agenda 21. So, we call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. J. Gary Lawrence, an advisor to the President, the President's Council on Sustainable Development, just told you right here, Agenda 21 is live and well in America. We just call it everything else but that. I'm told there is one city that is finally calling it Local Agenda 21, and that is San Diego. No?
Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz. I apologize. Thank you. Santa Cruz, California. So, there you go. Now, the purpose of this President's Council on Sustainable Development was to advise the President on the domestic implementation of policy options to reduce greenhouse emissions. Now, you remember I said that I believe that climate change is the driver? I'm fully convinced of that. It says the Council should not debate the science of global warming. In 1993, we should not debate the science of global warming, but should instead focus on the implementation of national and local greenhouse gas reduction policies and activities and adaptations in the U.S. economy and society to maximize societal benefits, minimize economic impacts, and are consistent with U.S. international agreements. This was in 1997. There wasn't enough research on global warming in 1997 to have an opinion either way. So this, to me, tells me that they had an agenda in mind from the beginning. So it didn't matter whether climate change was real or not. We're going to assume that it's real and implement all of these policies to try to prevent it, right?
It's PCSC,
President's Council on Sustainable Development. Okay. So here's some of the recommendations and actions from Toward America. Continue to support integration of sustainable development into federal programs. You will not find a federal agency that is not involved in sustainable development, period. Overcome legal, fiscal, and policy barriers and impediments. What do you think that means? How about when one particular agency may not have the authority to do something or the money, but another agency does have the authority or the money? Well, they sign what we call memorandums of understanding, memorandums of agreement, and other reciprocal working agreements. And they'll come along, let's say EPA wants to do X, but they don't have the money for it. Let's say Department of Transportation does. So EPA has the authority but no money. Department of Transportation doesn't have the authority but it does have the money. So what do? They'll put the funds right over to the EPA and the EPA does whatever it is they need to do because of these working agreements with each other. And we saw this in the Blue Way documents really big time. We're going to enhance capital flow toward new climate-friendly technologies, and we're going to enable and enhance markets to go low carbon. When you see enhance and enable coming from the federal government, what are they going to do? They're either going to give you the money to do it, they're going to tax you if you don't. Okay, so they're going to enhance and enable, all right, yeah.
Today, in his weekly address, President Obama talked about climate change is no longer a distant threat. It has moved firmly into the present. So that's what he's pushing.
He is pushing it very, very heavily. How about when he was talking to the guys at the graduation commencement at West Point?
Yeah.
He said the same thing. He also said that climate change is going to impact what you're doing while you're in uniform. Are you kidding me? Well, yeah, because our armed forces wind up being your local disaster troops that go all over the world. I mean, it's great. Okay, one thing. This gentleman gave me this nice box of water. It's really, really cool. It comes from Norway and 100% recyclable paper, and that's just fine. But I want to write Icebox water, committed to sustainability. Neato, huh? Who shops at Aldi? I do too. It's not wrong shopping at Aldi. Aldi's a decent place, right? All green. Look at their paper bags. Talk about sustainable development. So, all right. So with these enable low carbon footprint. I'm sick and tired of hearing that stuff too. But we're going to enable and enhance these markets to go this way. We're going to develop a certification program for green power. Electricity consumers should stimulate demand for clean energy products by purchasing certified green. Let's take a little trip down propaganda lane, okay? Let's say that the government comes out and you start seeing on TV or on the radio, first of all about the forests, okay? The more and more you hear about it, you might want to take a trip to the woods, right? Well, how about the more and more you hear that energy products that we use are using a lot of energy, and that there are smarter ways that we can do things, and that there's this neat little program out there called Energy Star. Does your appliance have Energy Star on it? They all do now. They used to not. So let's walk through this. How would you as an electricity consumer stimulate a demand for clean energy products? First of all, you have to be propagandized that you need clean energy products. Right, that's the first thing. The next thing you're going to come across is you continue to hear it. Look at, only a few of us like to swim against the flow. Most of us are going to go with the flow. You start hanging around with your friends at church or school or wherever it might be, and they start talking about going green, and you start talking about it a little bit. So then eventually you'll get to the point where, well, we need to have appliances that don't use as much energy. And Whirlpool has this neat washing machine. It uses a lot less energy, so I'm going to start buying Whirlpool products. And prior to that, the government, and this is just an example, I don't know this to be true, but I know this is how it works. The government came down to Whirlpool and said, hey guys, guess what? We have this neat program. And by the way, we're going to give you a few $100 million if you help implement this program. Sure, we'll take your $100 million. You betcha. We'll help implement. What do we got to do? Put the sticker on there? and maybe reduce its electricity consumption by 10%? We can do that. So Whirlpool does it. Now Whirlpool has taken the money, Whirlpool makes the product, and Whirlpool starts advertising it to you. You're a dummy if you don't go buy a Whirlpool product that has this neat sticker on it. Well, guess what? When you go down to Sears and want to buy a Kenmore, and you say, hey, Mr. Kenmore dealer, I want one with it. Oh, well, we don't have the Energy Star sticker. Well, we're not going to buy your product. I'm going to go buy a Whirlpool. Because I am now demanding these clean energy products. If you are a manufacturer of washing machines, what are you going to do? Hey, Mr. Government, how can I be an Energy Star product too? So now you get everybody falling in line just like they wanted to fall in line. And now you can't go to the store and buy a product that doesn't have an Energy Star on it. Any of the bigger appliances. So this is how these things happen. And there's actually I've got it somewhere. There's actually a chart, and they're following how this process is working. I do have till 10:15, right, Judy?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so government and businesses should procure. They're buying every single thing that they can. Guess how many? I don't know how many they are. The Chevy Volt. The government bought them all. I don't know a single individual consumer that owns one. Do you? I've never seen a Chevy Volt on the road. The federal government owns it. Actually, I think the Prius is kind of a neat little car. Some friends of mine have one that says legalize the Constitution on the side. It completely confuses the liberals. So, they give, this is another way they do these things. They give tax incentives. We're going to improve the infrastructure by building bike racks, bus shelters, bike paths, and walking paths. So here's another way they do these sorts of things. Let's say you don't necessarily want a bike path in your town. Well, how about somebody through the Missouri Regional Planning Commission, or what's Gateway Green Street? Yeah, those guys. Let's say they come along to a municipality and they say, you know what? I know where we can get you $100,000 to put in a sidewalk. Would you like to do that? Sure. Well, how about along the way? This is the only thing you have to do to get this money, okay? Every so often you have to build a bike rack. Is that okay? You're paying for it, right? Okay, yeah, we'll build a bike rack. So now we have all these bike racks and bus shelters, all these other things. Aren't people riding bikes? Bus shelters don't exist. Or the bus routes don't exist, but the shelters could wind up being there. These folks think very, very far ahead in the future. They're already looking at a 50 or 100-year plan, guys. They know Lenexa, Kansas has a Vision 2050. There's also an America 2050, isn't there? Okay, so these guys are looking this far ahead. And to do that, if they know what they want here, which is that biological diversity map, they start way down here, putting in all the structure and infrastructure and everything that it's going to take to wind up getting there. So they're going through all these different layers and processes. And today, it might be something that you look at and you'll say, that's not such a bad idea, let's do that. And then maybe the next year, they'll build on that a little bit and you'll say, well, what is that going to cost? Yeah, I'm not sure I'm in on that one, but yeah, maybe. And then by the time they've got you here, and you're saying, no, I don't want this anymore, it's too late. All of your master plans, the infrastructure is in place, and by the way, those who are just kind of lemmings going along with it all will say, oh, we've already spent all this money, we might as well continue to do it, right? So then that's how they continue to do things. They're going to give communities credit when they use community design that encourages more efficient land use patterns, or just by going sustainable. They're going to support research of intelligent transportation systems. What's an intelligent transportation system? A bike? Yeah, maybe. High-speed rail is a big thing. There could be some others. How about just the fact that out in California, they're now doing some lanes that the cars are driving themselves or something of this nature? You know, that's an example. So they're pouring tons of money into this stuff, your money into these developments. Encourage land use planning that promotes reuse of materials and brownfields, reduce sprawl, and preserve green space. Running short on time, not going to go into this a whole lot. Green space is a really big word you're going to see an awful lot of. We won't get into the brownfields too much. This is how sustainable development happens in Missouri. If you got one of the packets, you'll find this. It has MACOG, the Missouri Association of Counties, local of government. Missouri Regional Planning Commissions come from this. MRSMO Chapter 251. The regional planning commissions were really supposed to just be there as an advisors. They are now the conduit, the east-west gateway is the same conduit, for money to flow from the federal government through the states down to the local communities to help implement this sort of stuff. And
What
Amy will
is
talk about
The regional planning?
regional planning commissions are the ones where they're now they're the middle guy, as it were. So let's say, for instance, your local town. Well, this is how it happened in Lebanon. All right, I don't know who came up with the idea, but I think it was a planning commission. Came down to the city of Lebanon and they said, you know what? We have this neat program from the federal government that if you go around to business owners within the town and find out how many of them would be willing to upgrade their buildings with newer, smarter, energy-efficient stuff. Be it new windows, air conditionings that are more efficient, heaters that are more efficient, whatever. We'll give you a bunch of money to help build that. It's going to be a a cost-sharing sort of thing. So let's say the business is willing to invest 50% into this project. The government will kick in the other 50%, and that would be the federal government's kicking in this money, okay? All right, so they went around to several businesses in town, and they had, I'll just use a number, $300,000 to spend. And I don't even know if that's close, but it's just a number. They couldn't come up with enough businesses that were willing to participate. What happens when you get a grant and you don't spend it all? You're not going to get that grant again. I can almost assure you of that. Okay? So what did they do then? Not only did they do that, they went then to the city and said, hey, we've got to spend this somehow. They took out these really tall, they were ugly looking lights that lit up one of the streets downtown, but they put out a lot of light. They were very useful. They then put these neat looking sort of lights. They were shorter and had, guess what, fluorescent bulbs in them and give off about this much light. Okay? That's where they spent the rest of the money. They got to the very end of that money and had a few $1,000s left over and could not figure out how to get rid of it. Again, a grant. You've got to spend it, folks. What did they do? They took out full-page ads in our local newspaper for as long as they had to, touting how they spent all of this money for improvements and where the money came from until that money was completely depleted. So this is how this happens. Money flows through these different agencies. When you get down to a city council, who's not going to take $250,000 to go into your community? You are going to. Most of them, they all do it. They're just doing it. I'm waiting for that one to, Salem, Missouri. So I won't get into this too much. Regional planning commissions. This is how they do the things they do through memorandums of understanding. We talked about that a little bit, memorandums of agreement. ICLEI is a problem that Amy will talk about. Here's that stakeholder partners we talked about a little bit. If anybody ever tries to tell you that Agenda 21 is not in America, I want you to look at these two statements. One is from the Blue Way nomination documents, and the other one is from Agenda 21, Section 18.8. Tell me the difference between those two statements. Trick question. There isn't a difference, is there? No. So right there is coming directly from our American folks that are wanting to do this Blue Way stuff, and this is coming out of Agenda 21. It's all the same people. You'll find out that a lot of these folks will work for a non-government organization, then they'll work for the government, then they'll get higher in the government, then maybe they'll come back out to an NGO, and it's just kind of like a big circle of incest as far as I look at it. They just continuously move from agency to agency, from one NGO, and they just continue to promulgate everything that they want to do. Like I said, Amy will go into that more. That's probably all I have on the history of Agenda 21. They're really, really close on implementing. They're a lot farther than they thought they could be, but they're mad at the United States because we're not going far enough and we're not doing it quick enough. And if you think that the federal government is the serious problem, and although they are, this is a 2010 document created by the Missouri Department of Conservation, and it only has to deal with Missouri's Forest Resource Assessment and Strategy. Seeking a sustainable future for Missouri's forest resources. This right here is very, very current. We need to learn about this, and we all need to put some input. We have until July 8th. We can talk about this at the end of the day. I want to talk about our packet at the end of the day, and I have some DVDs over there that we can talk about. This is Missouri Non-Point Source Management Plan. It's a draft plan. They're working, this is double page, so single page would be that thick. And let me tell you what, I've started reading this, and again, if you don't have a serious dictionary and the computer with you to find out what they're talking about, you will read 2 or 3 pages and put it down and say, I've had enough.
Who's behind that?
This is Department of Natural Resources and the EPA, they're partnering. And of course, the Missouri Department of Conservation. But the Missouri DNR is putting this thing out. Missouri Non-Point Source Management Plan. What this effectively does is implement the Blue Waste system across the entire state through our local agencies. So it's not the feds doing it, it's our guys. So
When did that
that's-
start?
I'm sorry?
When did that?
This is a draft. They're not doing it yet. They have been using a watershed approach for a long time, but they haven't really been, the non-point source, this is becoming a serious issue. It has been at the federal level for some time. They're now starting to sneak out into the communities to see how they can implement it. Basically what they're looking at is they'll say, let's say you have a few hogs on your farm, okay? You have a piece of property, let's say you got a few pigs, right? Let's say the water, when it rains real bad, washes down into a little bitty dry creek bed along in your property. And let's say when it rains real heavy, that little dry creek bed fills up and it flows down to a bigger creek and then a bigger creek and then onto a river. Well, let's say that they determine that there's too much E. coli in this particular stream over here. Well, where is that coming from? They'll trace it all the way maybe back to your pigs. And once they find you, they will then start regulating how you deal with your pigs on your property. The problem with Agenda 21 and private property is not that they are using eminent domain to take the property from you. As a matter of fact, they will allow you to keep the property right there in your hands so that you can continue to pay taxes on it. What they will do is they will regulate you to a point where you can't use your property.
Yep.
That is the problem when it comes to private property ownership on Agenda 21.
And
That's
that's
all.
happening right now?
Absolutely.
You guys, if you have a soil and water district conservation,
Yep.
we have it in Cape Girardeau.
Yep. Join your water board.
Join it. Go to one meeting and walk away scared to death.
Yep.
Yes, and they are so on board with this, innocent, and forgive me, they're all Republicans that are on this board, ignorant, because they're not doing what we're doing, and that's finding out.
That's exactly right.
They're
They
signing up right off the dotted line.
Yeah, and they're looking at a very, very narrow window, because I don't want the water in my town to be contaminated either. All right, I do want, well, I'm sorry, I'm a Republican, and I have my own private stash of water and air. I don't want everybody else's to be dirty, right? No, but, so we don't want that to happen, so we have to be able to take an eye on these things, and your local individuals might be concerned about it, but the folks ahead of them that are pushing it, they are not. That is not their actual agenda. It's about control. That's all I got. Thank you. My time's up. We'll talk to you later.